Hi there. I'm Lionel Windsor, New Testament lecturer at Moore Theological College in Sydney. This is part one of a wide-ranging chat I had with my Old Testament colleague Chris Thomson about the meaning of righteousness and justification in the Bible. In this first part, we look at the meaning of righteousness. You'll also notice that I've had a haircut since we recorded the chat. Enjoy. Well, welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome today Chris Thomson, who's my colleague here at Moore College. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Chris is a lecturer in Old Testament here at Moore College, and we actually just live a few doors from each other. So even though we're doing this chat in isolation, we could theoretically walk on out into the street, lean over and say hi to each other. But we're not doing that. We're doing this in our houses for good reason. How are you going, Chris, just generally in your, in the last few weeks of isolation and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm going pretty well, thanks, Lionel. I've actually found it reasonably straightforward adjusting. I was actually helped by the interview that you did with Simon and Margie Gillam a couple of weeks ago about culture shock, and actually chatting to Simon personally. He said to me, I imagine a lot of the skills that you acquired when you moved over from the UK to Australia, which was quite a hard move for me. I imagine you're probably finding that you now have a lot of those skills of adapting to a new culture. And I think that's been my experience. I think the idea of being at a distance from loved ones, the idea of having to get to grips with new norms, new rituals and so on, that's been, I think, smoother for me than for some other friends of mine. So I'm thankful to God for that. How about you? How's it going with you?
Yeah, I think we're generally going okay. I think in our household, sometimes there've been some tensions and some disappointments and sadnesses about things. I'm really looking forward to seeing people face to face. But compared to many people, relatively, we're going okay, and yeah, we have a good setup. So that's good. We're very grateful to God for that, knowing that it's not true for everyone.
Yeah.
Now we're actually talking today about an issue that's got nothing directly, it's not directly related to the issue of COVID-19 or isolation, but it's perpetually relevant and important to talk about. And I think it's important, and I know that you, Chris, think it's important. It's the question of the meaning of righteousness and justification. And just in relation to the question of justification and justification by faith only, I go back to Martin Luther's great point that if this article, that is this doctrine of justification, collapses, then the church collapses, and if it stands, then the church stands. And that's just a way of expressing the significance and importance that Luther and many others attach to these kinds of questions. And I think that's true. I mean, it's not true. I don't think any of us believe that you can't be a Christian unless you fully understand all the minute details of justification. That's not what it's saying. But what it is saying is that it's so core and so relevant to our relationship with God and what it means to be His people that we need to get it right. And the other thing about those, that the reformers, so Luther and Calvin, as well as many others, is that they actually saw the meaning of the words as being really significant. It's one of the reasons that Luther pointed us to, or have said that it's really important to look at the original languages in Greek and Hebrew. Luther's own understanding and conversion was affected through seeing what the real meaning of righteousness was in Romans 1:17. And Calvin, when he begins his discussion of justification in his Institutes, he spends quite a few pages saying, now we have got to get the meaning of the words right before we can start doing this. So that's what we're talking about today, the meaning of the words, not because it's just something that is, an esoteric question, but because it's actually been seen by the reformers and by many. And I certainly think that's the case, that getting the meaning of the words right really does matter. I'm not sure about yourself, Chris. What's your interest in this? What's your take on those things?
Well, I absolutely agree that these are really foundational concepts. And for me, the reason I first got interested in righteousness, and righteousness was the subject of my master's thesis at Cambridge. So in 2007, I left Oak Hill College, where I'd been studying as an undergraduate student, and I went to Cambridge to pursue Old Testament scholarship. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to work in the Old Testament was it seems to me that that Old Testament theology is the theological foundation for the New Testament, and therefore the theological foundation for Christian doctrine. It's vitally important that we get the Old Testament right if we're going to understand the New Testament. And time and again, I would find myself reading the work of New Testament scholars or systematic theologians, and I would find myself reading their statements about the Old Testament and thinking, really, is that right? But they were sort of making assumptions about what the Old Testament was saying. And my interest in righteousness came from reading Tom Wright and interacting with people who are big fans of Tom Wright. And Tom Wright bases his whole understanding of justification on what he says is the meaning of the word righteousness in the Old Testament and the meaning of the word justification in the Old Testament. And he makes the point time and time again that it's really important when we're understanding, say, the Apostle Paul, to understand the Hebrew context of those words, to understand what those words mean in the Hebrew Bible. But the thing was that as I looked at the Hebrew Bible for myself, I didn't think that the words meant what Tom Wright was saying that they meant. And so I thought, well, it would be really interesting for a master's thesis to actually look at the vocabulary around righteousness and justification in the Hebrew Bible and ask the question, what does it mean? And to look at what the Old Testament scholars were saying about righteousness, because Tom Wright in those works was not citing Old Testament scholars. He was just saying that this is accepted. And so I wanted to go back to those scholars and explore what the Old Testament scholarship says, what the Hebrew Bible itself says, what Jewish tradition and early Christian tradition says about those words. And so that was my master's thesis was actually on righteousness in the book of Isaiah. But in the course of that, I had a chapter that was really a survey of I looked at every instance of the relevant Hebrew root in all the scriptures. And most of that chapter had to get chopped out. Perhaps one day it will see the light of day in published form. But several years later, there was a symposium at the Theological University in Kampen in the Netherlands. And they had Tom Wright coming. There was going to be a book launch, and I think it was his book, When God Became King, had just been translated into Dutch. And so he agreed to come to Theological University, and he gave a paper that was based on his book, Paul and the Faithfulness of God. And they wanted 3 scholars to respond to him, one from New Testament, one from Old Testament, one from systematic theology. And a friend of mine who's there at the Theological University, Walter Rosa, said, well, I know somebody who's done a lot of work on righteousness in the Old Testament. Let's invite him. So I got the opportunity to actually interact with Tom Wright in person at that conference. And that was very eye-opening as well, because I gave a paper on what does this group of words mean in the Hebrew Bible? And Wright's reaction was surprise. He said, is Dr. Thompson really disagreeing with all of these biblical scholars who think that it means something else? And I chatted to him privately afterwards, and I said, I'm not quite sure what you meant, because those scholars don't take your view. So he pointed me to a couple of specific references, and that led to a really fruitful conversation about the meaning of terms like forensic and relational as they're used in Old Testament scholarship, how he was understanding that Old Testament scholarship and then using those words, and actually what the Old Testament tradition understands by those words. So actually that was quite eye-opening for me in terms of realizing what's behind, I think, quite a significant difference between Old Testament scholarship and at least Tom Wright's version of New Testament scholarship. And so I've kept up that interest since then, and I'm hoping at some point to publish an adapted version of that paper that I gave there and also gave subsequently at Cambridge.
Oh, great. That's good. I know that we've had a few discussions with that, but I wasn't sure of that entire history. But that's really helpful. And I mean, my own interest is a little bit less in depth, but I still do see it is very important. So in my time when I became a Christian, the actual my own conversion was actually affected through understanding that God accepts me entirely on the basis of Jesus and what he's done rather than anything that's in me or any righteousness that's in me. And so that's been very important for me. And as time has gone on and reading the Reformers and reading in Pauline theology, it's just come back again and again. And I almost wish like that I had more time to discuss these things. But this is my excuse for us to chat about it and for us to chat about it with other people listening in, I guess, because it is so important. And I've picked up similar things from reading things that Tom Wright and others have written and going, is that really the case? So maybe we should go back to think then a little bit more, and maybe right from the start. So you and I, we haven't really had a huge chat about this beforehand, but one of the things that we said beforehand is it's really important for us to, right from the beginning, to help people to see that there's actually two very important, they're related, but they're also distinct questions here or fields or areas. One question or field or area, maybe it's not a field, but one question is, what does righteousness mean generally? What does the word righteousness mean? And the word righteousness, and then also just the general word group associated with righteousness in the Bible, and therefore particularly in the Old Testament, but moving across into the New Testament as well. What does righteousness mean? What's the range of meanings? What is it? What's the basic meaning? That's one thing. What does righteousness mean? And the second question is, well, what about justification? What does justification mean? And why is justification something that Paul talks about and that is so significant? And those two things are related to each other, but they're not identical. And so sometimes the discussions can proceed as if, especially in the New Testament field, as I hear people in Pauline theology, they'll say, they'll say, well, righteousness means, and then they go on to give a definition that sounds more like justification, thinking that they're defining righteousness, but they're actually defining justification. But you can't really understand one without the other. And so those two things are distinct but separate. Did you want to add to that or clarify?
No, I absolutely agree. And I think, the field of study that I wrote my master's thesis on, and it's also one that I came back to after my PhD and postdoctoral work, is what we call lexical semantics. So that's to do with meaning of words. And one of the principles of lexical semantics is that when you have a group of words that share a root, which the terms righteousness and justification do in both Greek and Hebrew, they share a root, they're related etymologically. So they come from the same origin. But it's a basic principle of lexical semantics that you have to look at each word individually, and you can't assume that the meaning of one word transforms onto another. So if one of my students said to me that I was a terrific teacher, I'd be really happy. If they said I was a terrible teacher, I'd be really unhappy. But those two words come from the same root that has to do with fear. Am I awesome or am I awful? And it's like that with righteousness and justification. Actually, I think the fact that in English we use two different roots, we use the right root and the justify root, I think it actually helps us. But you quite often read in works of biblical theology, it's a real shame that in English we don't have one word that covers for both. And so people make up words like righteousify, or they talk about justice rather than talking about righteousness. But I think they are distinct words, and I think they express different concepts.
Okay, so that's helpful. And theologically, it matters too, because actually, if you start talking about righteousness, then you're not necessarily talking about justification and our standing before God, and vice versa. So to get that, well, then let's ask the question. Then let's start with righteousness. I want to ask you from your research in Isaiah and the Old Testament and elsewhere, what is righteousness? What does it mean?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think as academics we always want to give kind of complex, nuanced, multifaceted answers. So I'm going to try and keep this simple, and say that I think the basic meaning of there are two words in Hebrew that we translate as righteousness. One is the word zedek, and one is the word tzedakah. So they come from the same root. They both have Tzadeh, Dalet, Kof as their 3 root letters. So they're related, but they're not exactly synonymous. So, and both of them tend to get translated in the Greek Old Testament as dikasune. So both of them, I think, are relevant when we come to understand the Greek language. But
is one
broadly
an
speaking,
the other a noun? Sorry, so just to
come?
I mean, there's one an adjective and the other a noun. Is that?
No, they're both nouns. So there's also there's an adjective which corresponds, which is tzaddik.
Oh, tzaddik. Sorry, yes, tzaddik. Yeah.
So tzaddik is an adjective and means essentially a righteous person.
Yes. Okay.
Righteousness is zedek or tzedakah. And broadly speaking, zedek refers to the quality of righteousness. If you're a tzaddik, then you're somebody who is characterized by zedek. It means that you're a good person. You could understand it as moral goodness. Whereas tzedakah typically refers to good behavior. So it's actually an action word. And you can, not every Old Testament scholar agrees on that distinction, but there's a few significant articles which I think prove it beyond any reasonable doubt, I think, in my mind. There's some overlap. But what you find, for example, is that the word to do in Hebrew, that verb, quite often has tzedakah as its object, but it never has zedek as its object. So zedek is not something you do, tzedakah is something you do. And you often find zedek used in a construction we call a genitive of quality. So you find paths of zedek or weights of zedek and so on. So it's a word that can be used to describe the quality of something. But it's a moral quality. There's a few cases where it's used with inanimate objects like weights or scales, but I think even there it has moral connotations. The idea is that you're not cheating in your weights and measures and so on. And I think it's really important to stress it is a moral quality. So whenever it occurs in combination with other phrases, it's phrases like uprightness, cleanness of hands, it's contrasted with wickedness, and one of the best ways to work out what a word means is look at its opposites. It's used in some cases. It's used in a law court setting, a forensic setting, but it's really important to stress, and this is one of the points where I differ very strongly with Tom Wright. In the law court setting, to be tzaddik, to possess zedek, it's not something that the court confers on you. It's whether you're actually innocent or guilty of that particular crime. So a tzaddik in the law court setting is an innocent person, not somebody that the court has found innocent.
And so the reason it's being used in a law court setting is because the law court is seeking to determine whether this person is tzaddik.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And so you get passage like in Proverbs, I think it's 17:15. It says somebody who justifies, that is, acquits the wicked, or finds in favor of the wicked, and somebody who condemns the righteous, who finds against the person who is in the right, they're an abomination to the Lord. But you can see that would be a contradiction in terms if you didn't become a tzaddik until the court had actually found in your favor. It's theoretically impossible, although grossly unjust, to justify the guilty.
Even theoretically possible.
The innocent.
Yeah. And so that's what an unjust judge would do, or an unrighteous judge would do. Yeah. I think what you're saying there is exactly what I've seen, and I remember the passage in Tom Wright's book on Justification, where he makes it very, very clear, and he says, no good Reformed or Lutheran theologian could ever disagree with this. He says that righteousness is not a moral quality, he says. Yeah. And if you're a good Reformed or Lutheran theologian, of course you'd agree with me there. And then
which is odd, because Tom Wright says again and again that we need to go back to the Bible and look at what the Bible says. But there he's sort of, he's saying, well, my theological framework makes me say this, and I agree with you. I think he's wrong about that.
Yeah, but I think the reason, and here's my guess, but I think the reason he says it is because he's confusing righteousness with justification. So that is, no good Protestant or Reformed theologian would disagree that justification is about, it's not about the quality within us. It's about God's declaration, or however you want to put it. So in terms of justification, that's true. But just in terms of what the word righteousness means, which is what we're talking about right now, that's not true. And we need to be understanding what righteousness means first, before we start discussing what justification means, to see why justification is so surprising.
Absolutely. You're a New Testament scholar. Would you say the same is true of the New Testament when Paul, for example, talks about dikaiosune? Is he always talking about righteousness in that sense of moral behavior?
Yes, I would. And as I look it up, as I look at the dictionaries of BDAG and others, that's how it comes across. However, I'm saying that as a New Testament scholar, where currently I know that as I read many eminent New Testament scholars, I'm not actually agreeing with them at that point, because I think that they've actually confused righteousness and justification. So I think many New Testament scholars do that. And that's actually quite unfortunate in many ways. And we've forgotten that. But certainly for my money, I would say, yes, that is the case. That righteousness, dikaiosune, and the dikaios, that the adjective that describes the person, is a moral quality. And that's actually what makes justification so surprising. That's the issue. So I've also found that when I say that righteousness is a moral quality, that certain quite vocal, strongly reformed people will jump up and down and say, no, you're wrong, because you're undermining justification by faith if you say it's a moral quality. And I think, again, there's that misunderstanding that it's actually the reason that justification by faith is so incredibly important and surprising is because righteousness is a moral quality. But justification is not a moral quality, and that's the distinction between the two. I know I feel like I'm labouring the point here, but I think we need to do that to help us to see that. But yes, so I agree there. It's moral. It's measuring up to the moral standard, and therefore the English word right actually is pretty good as a translation, because righteous, because right and wrong, we use right and wrong for moral qualities. And so righteous is a reasonable thing to do then, I guess.
I mean, I think the word we normally would use is good. You would say, Noah was a good person in his generation. It doesn't mean that he's perfect, but he's good. And I think it's helpful as well, I think, to note that righteousness is something that there's a scale. It's not something that you either are righteous or you're not righteous. So you can be more righteous than somebody else. So there's a few passages, for example, Judah and Tamar in Genesis 8:38. He says, she is more righteous than I. Or Saul says to David, you are more righteous than I. So it's not something that you either are or you're not righteous. It's something that there can be degrees of. And I think because there can be degrees of it, you can say without contradiction that a particular person is righteous, and yet there is no one who is wholly righteous. There's no one who's entirely righteous. Just as Jesus does with the word good. So Jesus says in Matthew 5 that God makes I forget if it's the sun or the rain, he brings the sun or the rain on both the good and the evil, and he uses a plural noun there. So what he's saying is, God shows favor to all people, both good people and bad people. But later on in Matthew, he says, there is only one who is good, God. So how is it not a contradiction that there are good people in the world and yet no one is good apart from God? Well, because you can use the word in an absolute sense or in a relative sense. And I think that's significant, because it actually means that the good things that we do, they're not irrelevant to God. God does note them and regard them as righteous. But I think it's also true that because we all sin, that righteousness that we have, that comes to us because of our good deeds, it's not sufficient for us to then be able to approach God as though we hadn't sinned ever. So I think that's an important distinction. That I can say Lionel Windsor is a good person, and at the same time I can say, but he's not good in the way that Jesus is good. He's not 100% good. He's not somebody who has no sin to declare when he meets God on the last day.
Can I? And I think that's very right. Can I come in there to just to run something by you? And that is that the thing about these words tzedek and as well as dikaiosune in the Greek is that often they're words that are talking about measuring up to usually a moral standard, conforming to a moral norm. And so partly it depends on what kind of standard you're using as to whether you determine that someone is righteous or not. And so if the standard is, for example, in the Psalms, David pleads his righteousness. And he's doing that in the face of his enemies, and he's doing that in the face of the wicked. And he's saying, well, look at me. I trust you, God. Vindicate me because I'm righteous. He's not saying vindicate me because I'm completely morally perfect. And the case with Bathsheba is just an obvious example. But that's not what he's saying. He's just saying, in terms of the standards of whether or not I am doing the right thing by following you and basically being innocent in this situation, I'm righteous. So vindicate me. And that's true in many places. Yeah,
I think that's true. I think there are different interpretations of those phrases. There's a whole monograph has been written on it. But I think that's important to say, and perhaps I should have said this earlier, that righteousness can be used in different ways. You can use, and just for simplicity, I'll lump together those three words that I've already mentioned. I'll leave aside the related verb, which is a little different, but those words tzedek, tzedakah, and the adjective zadik. You can use them to describe someone in a general sense, but you can also use them in a situation to say whether you're in the right in that situation. An illustration I've sometimes used is if you imagine that there was some murder on the streets of Sydney, and let's say there was some gangster who was known to the police, who'd committed a whole bunch of other crimes. Let's say that mobster had a cast iron alibi and turned up in court and said, I'm innocent. And the judge says, I find you innocent. That doesn't mean that person hasn't committed any crimes. It means that they're innocent of that particular crime. And so sometimes the word zadik is used for innocence in relation to a particular crime or a particular accusation. Sometimes it's used in a general sense of somebody's character. And that's what Old Testament scholars mean when they talk about the forensic use. And I think this hits on, I think, one of those misunderstandings that I mentioned with Tom Wright, because when we had that conversation in Kampen, he said to me, well, look at Skinner's commentary on Genesis, the ICC commentary on Genesis. He uses the word forensic in describing the interaction between Judah and Tamar. And he does indeed, but he means by it that she's righteous in that particular situation that they're in. It's not a general statement of her character.
So to clarify, just to clarify that is when Judah says to Tamar, you are more righteous than I.
Yeah.
There's a sense of that. It's like a metaphorical quasi law court sort of thing.
Exactly. Exactly.
If they were appealing for a judge in this issue, then
exactly. But the judge has not yet declared the verdict. But nevertheless, Tom Wright has taken that word forensic and taken it to mean that means it's a legal declaration. But you also mentioned norms, and I think that leads us on to the second important thing it's important to realize about the Old Testament scholarship is that there's been a debate, probably going back to Kramer. I know you've done some work on Kramer. I'll ask you about him in a moment. But at the end of the 19th century, Kramer introduced this idea that righteousness was something relational. And Old Testament scholars have debated, is righteousness about relationship or is it about norm? And you'll find in a lot of the discussions about righteousness among Old Testament scholars, that's the way the debate is framed. Is it a relationship or is it a norm? And basically what the norm people are saying is that there's this, that righteousness is to do with conformity to a standard. And early on, people were getting that from their understanding of the etymology of the relevant words. So the idea is that righteousness is to do with meeting a particular standard. And those phrases I talked about earlier, like the scales of righteousness and the weights of righteousness, people were saying, oh, it's not to do with integrity and honesty. It's actually to do with just, their proper weights. So there was this idea that righteousness was all about a norm. But then others came along and they said, well, no, it's not about a norm. It's not about an objective standard that always applies. It's actually about a relationship. And righteousness is doing what is right within the confines of a particular relationship. And the relationship determines what is right. So not every Old Testament scholar would agree with the way that you put it, that it's about a norm. Yep. A lot of them would say it's actually about a relationship. Now, for what it's worth, I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy. The Judah and Tamar, that episode in Genesis 38, for some reason, that's the example that everyone goes to say it's about a relationship. And the idea is that the reason that Judah is able to say, she's more righteous than I, is because even though she's done something wrong, if you remember the story, she's pretended to be a prostitute and she slept with him and then she's got pregnant. The argument goes, but she rather than he did what was required by the relationship. Now, the reason I think it's a false dichotomy is I think whenever you've got the question of is somebody doing what's right or are they doing what's wrong, there's normally a relationship involved at some level. At the very least in the Hebrew Bible, you've got the relationship with God and the covenant framework that's helping us understand what is right and wrong in a particular context. But I think at the same time, there's always a norm as well. So there's a norm of how I should relate to my father. There's a norm of how I should relate to my servant. There's a norm of how, in the Hebrew Bible, I don't have a servant personally, but norms and relationships, I think, are both part of the context. What I would say is that the word itself doesn't bring with it those associations. It's the context. So just in the same way that a tall ship is taller than a tall man. I think the word tall is not tall with reference to some objective standard. It's just tall, and the context tells me what I expect of tallness in a particular context. Now, with relationship, Tom Wright's understanding, which I think is quite unique to him, I think even old New Testament scholars don't tend to follow him on this. His understanding is that righteousness means being in the relationship. So, and again, he cites Old Testament scholars, people like Gerhard von Rad and others, and he says, well, they say that righteousness is a relational concept. And he takes them to mean that they think the righteous person is somebody who is in relationship with God, somebody who's in the covenant, one of God's covenant people. But that's not what they mean. What they mean by relational is that the framework of the relationship, and in particular the covenant framework, is what tells you what right and wrong looks like. So that's really significant. When I read Romans 4 and it talks about God crediting righteousness. As I read that as an Old Testament scholar, it seems to me that it means that God gives the credit that's due to somebody who's done right, somebody who's fulfilled God's requirements. But Tom Wright reads that completely differently, and he thinks that crediting righteousness means declaring that somebody is one of the people of God in that relationship with God. So that's quite a significant distinction.
Yeah, definitely. Just reflecting on, there's a number of things to reflect on. Just in the last you said about Tom Wright in his translation of Romans in the New Testament for Everyone, I think it's called. He'll actually, when he comes to the word righteousness, he'll actually translate that as a member of the covenant. So he won't translate it as righteousness. He thinks it means it's a membership word. So that's certainly true. But I don't really know if many people follow him on that. Yeah, and I think that is right. So in my head, I just had the idea of conforming with the norm just there, but I'd never seen a huge dichotomy either. Partly because the thing about morality is that it so often has to do with relationships, and so what is right and wrong? Very often, it's got to do with how we relate to people, and if it doesn't necessarily have to do with how we relate to people. In the biblical worldview, it has to do with how we relate to God. And so it's always caught up with a conformity. If it's a conformity to a norm, it's a norm that's been established by God, the Creator. And so it's got to do with a right relationship with God, the Creator, who has put these norms and established these norms because of his own character and who he is, and will also call us to account. And so for that reason, it's relational, and there's a forensic element to it, knowing that God the Creator will call us to account.
But even there, I think I just want to just clarify that to some extent that's a theological statement.
Right.
The word itself, I think, doesn't imply anything about a relationship with God. So, for example, Gentiles can describe themselves as Tzaddik. So when Abraham spends time with Abimelech, a Gentile king, and Abimelech, you remember that Abraham says that Sarah is actually his sister, and so Abimelech takes her into his harem, and he says, and then he's afflicted by God, and he says, look, we're a goy tzaddik, we're an innocent nation. He's not saying anything about their relationship with God. He's just saying, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't touch her.
So it is a broad word that can be used theologically.
So it's a very, very broad word. And it's really important that although it might be used in a particular context with particular theological shape and particular theological overtones, they're not intrinsic to the meaning of the word. And I think, this is something else where I would differ with Tom Wright. He thinks that the word is inherently a covenantal word. I just happen to think it gets used a lot in the context of the covenant because the covenant is everywhere in the Bible. It's often in the background, if not in the foreground. And so Tom Wright will point to passages where the vocabulary of righteousness is used in close connection with the vocabulary of covenant. And he'll say, well, that proves that it's a covenantal word. And I would say, no, it proves that they're associated, that they can coexist in the same context. But it doesn't tell you that the word can't exist outside of a covenantal context. So we've always got to be careful, as you said at the beginning, between the meaning of the words themselves and then the sort of theological things that we can do with those words and what they come to mean in whole sentences and paragraphs and books.
That's right. That's important. Just the basic observation that the translators, the Septuagint, were very happy to use dikaios suner, which was a word that's very common all over the place in Greek and isn't a covenantal word in general Greek. It's a word that means basically being right. It's used a lot by Plato and a whole lot of other people to mean being right, just, properly set up, goodness, etc. So, I think that's helpful. So righteousness. I think we've explored a little bit about that meaning of righteousness. Was there anything else that you wanted to say before we start to talk about justification? Then, was there anything else?
Well, I think one thing that might segue a little bit into justification is that I mentioned that there's a whole bunch of complications around the word, and there are. It's both those words zedek and tzedakah. They change their meaning in late biblical Hebrew and on into the pre-New Testament period. But I think one of the complications that is worth mentioning is that the word tzedakah sometimes can be used to refer to not just the righteous deed, but also, as it were, that righteous deed as it's remembered before God. And I think the metaphor that's in view is the metaphor of God keeping an account. And this is a metaphor that comes up a few times in the Hebrew Bible. I think you find it, for example, in Psalm 32, which is a really key text for justification because of the way that Paul uses it in Romans 4. But in Psalm 32, you've got this idea of sins being blotted out as a way of expressing divine forgiveness. And so the image is that God has a book where he records sins. And there are a couple of places as well where it seems to be that God is recording righteous deeds in a book. And that word tzedakah can be used to refer to that, if you like, that credit that you have in God's accounts. There's a couple of places in the Bible. I think the clearest, though, are a sort of post-Hebrew Bible, where you find, for example, in there's one of the letters from Elephantine is a letter to the Persian governor Bagohi, and the Jewish priests of what's now Elephantine, what was then the town of Yeb. They ask for permission to rebuild the temple, and they say, if you let us rebuild the temple, it says, you will have more righteousness, O governor, before the Lord, the God of heaven, than a person who offers him burnt offerings and sacrifices worth 1,000 talents of silver. So this idea that if you do a righteous deed, then you will kind of possess this almost thing, righteousness, before the God of heaven. And I think the metaphor is one of having a credit in God's accounts. I think that's the easiest way to understand it, because sin and righteousness are really two sides of the same coin, and that's something that you see very often with sin in the Hebrew Bible. I think it also, when Nehemiah says, "Remember me for what I've done," it's that same idea. And also in 4QMMT, which is in a text that Tom Wright quite often refers to, but 4QMMT
from the Dead Sea Scrolls, just for those who
yes, it's one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You get this phrase that if you kind of keep these laws, it will be credited to you as righteousness when you do what is upright and what is good before him. So this idea that righteousness is something that can be credited. Phinehas in Psalm 106, same idea. And I think what's being credited there is the good work. I think that's what's going on in Psalm 106. Tom Wright takes a different view of Psalm 106 because of the reference to covenant. But it seems to me that righteousness is something that can be credited, and you therefore kind of, in a sense, possess it before God. And so I think that starts to lead to the concept of justification. And I can talk about the Hebrew vocabulary around the verb justify.
Yeah. Just to pause, just to say that what you're saying is it is actually really important for the New Testament and for reading Paul, especially in Romans 4, as you said, because when Paul uses the language of crediting and righteousness, he's not using it in some vacuum. He's actually using it against the backdrop of the expectation is that crediting righteousness means God looking at a person's deeds, righteous deeds, and saying that is good in my account, and that has to do with things like eternal life and God's judgment or reward of eternal life. That's the kind of concept that people have in their heads as Jewish people when that language is used. Yeah, just to clarify that.
No, I think that's helpful. In the Old Testament, there's a basic framework, and the basic framework of the way that God interacts with righteousness and wickedness is that God rewards righteousness and punishes wickedness. And if he doesn't do that straight away, then the idea is that you have this book of account and that God keeps record, and that in the future, your sin will come back at you, your righteousness will come to you as a reward. And I think when we then ask the question, well, how is it that God is gracious towards people who are sinners? Then that's a really important theological question, but it's a question that comes within a basic framework, which says that normally you expect if you sin that you're going to be punished for the sin, and you expect if you do something good that you're going to be rewarded for it. But I think it is helpful to realize that righteousness is something that can be credited. Tom Wright sometimes says, well, it's, sometimes when he hears evangelicals talking about, imputation of righteousness, he says, well, righteousness isn't stuff that you can pass around. And I think that's a bit of a straw man. No one's saying that it's stuff that you're passing around a courtroom. What you're saying is that it's actually a record in a book that you can cross it out. You can cross it out, or you can write it in. And so you could theoretically cross somebody's sins out. You could theoretically chalk those sins up in a different book belonging to a different person, and the same with righteousness.
Well, that's the end of part 1. In part 2, we move on to talk about justification.